Hi, everyone. Sorry for missing today. I have to take my son to get a CT scan on a broken finger through the middle of the day. So I had to take the whole day off. So for homework for tomorrow, we're going to be looking at Romanticism. And so we're going to be working on artworks 106, 108, 111, 109, and 118. So make sure you prepare for those. Go ahead and watch the video that I've got right now. And then there's an additional UNESCO video there that I could not record. So our focus for today is going to be looking at 18th and 19th century architecture. And we're going to be focusing on how that architecture depicts class and society. So during the 18th and 19th century, and I would even dare say even today, Historicism is a very prevalent style of art history and architecture. And so what that basically means is that style of the structures is heavily influenced by styles of the past. And one of the reasons for the rise of this is things that we've mentioned before. Neoclassicism comes about because of many factors, but some of them are things like the excavation of Pompeii and Herculaneum in Italy, and then Lord Elgin bringing those Parthenon friezes back to England. And so here is Strawberry Hill. And can you tell what kind of revival it is based on the details of the structure? So from this interior image of the library, you can tell that it has a Gothic influence. So look at this lovely fireplace. It really looks like either a Gothic altar for one of those Madonna and Child paintings, or it looks like the pinnacle and spires of a Gothic church. You can see all that thin decorative detailing that leads the eye up towards the sky. So those that emphasis on light and vertical, so light and height. There's a lot of intricate detailing with the Gothic fan decoration and the vaulted ceilings, just like the vaulted ceilings of Chartres. Even the exterior has pointed windows, right? It has the castle element, which would be a medieval characteristic. How about this one? What kind of revival do you think this is? And then think about how you can justify your results. Well, this one is definitely influenced by the excavations of Herculaneum and Pompeii. It's a revival of Roman style. Look at the deep, rich marble floor, the marble columns, the classical order, and so on. It even has that Pompeian red color on the floor and on the doors. Westwood was a potter who actually had a colony made for his workers. And so he was doing a revival of ancient pottery in a new form. So you can see how there's a relief component rather than just painting with slip. This is the Atlas Museum in Berlin, and it was styled as if it was a Greek temple. It even has Greek sculpture like neoclassical sculptures coming out of the ceiling, or the roof, I should say. And that leads us to our image for today, which is 112, the Palace of Westminster. This is the House of Parliaments in London by Charles Barry and August W. Pugin. And so the old Parliament building was actually destroyed in a major fire in London. And so we will talk about the painter Joseph Mallalieu Turner later, but he actually went to the scene of the crime. So he went to the scene of the fire and actually made several sketches of it. And then he made some major paintings based on the devastation. You can see the remnants of the old House of Parliament in the background. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the Smart History video for you. And as you're watching the video, I want you to focus on 3 questions. Be jotting down some of these things in your note takers as you go. So what is it a revival style of? Why would they choose to do a revival style? And how is it modern? So why would they choose to do a revival style? And then how is it modern?
Looking across the River Thames at the Houses of Parliament in London.
It's tempting to think that this was built hundreds of years earlier than it was. It was built in the early Victorian era.
There was a great fire in 1834, and it burned down the old palace that had been here. And there was a competition that was held for designs for a new building. The competition had the stipulation that the new structure had to be designed in one of 2 historical styles. It had to either be Gothic or it could be Elizabethan, that is from the time of Shakespeare.
There were something like 97 entries to the competition, and the vast majority were in the Gothic style. So that's why this looks like it was built hundreds of years before. It's in the style of the Gothic, which dates from the late medieval period.
The competition was won by an architect whose name is Charles Barry, with the assistance of Augustus Pugin, who was responsible for the interior designs as well as the stained glass and some of the exterior decorative forms.
Pugin was known for his love of the Gothic, for his belief in the Gothic as the right and true moral style of architecture, and also a style of architecture that was associated with Englishness. This is why the competition stipulated it needed to be Elizabethan or Gothic. We think about the Gothic as French, but in England in the 19th century, the Gothic was English.
I think it raises the issue, why was the 19th century so fascinated with reviving older architectural styles? What was that about? And of course, the reason has to do with industrialization, with the new modern world and the way that that unsettled people.
Well, the modern era seemed ugly, period of factories and steam engines. It seemed like there was nothing beautiful about it. When they looked at the past, they saw the beautiful architecture of the Gothic period. They looked at the classical past and they saw beauty. But when they looked around them, they didn't see beauty. They saw the industrial world.
This was now a period when you could buy cheaply made goods for the first time, and the old systems of handicraft had been replaced. People had moved from the country where people had learned through apprenticeship traditions of making things, but now things were being produced by factories, and it was an unsettling period. So I think it's natural that people looked back to historical styles, especially a building like this, which was meant to be the seat of government.
And is still today the seat of government. This is where the House of Commons meets. This is where the House of Lords meets. This building represents the parliamentary system. So you're right, it had to really speak of tradition.
But it really speaks of a kind of falsehood. This is not the Gothic. It is a modern invention. In fact, the building itself uses quite a number of modern innovations in its constructive techniques. It's an enormous building on a concrete bed, certainly not a medieval tradition, concerned with ventilation. In fact, the central tower was added to the design in order to help support ventilation in the building. And so this building really is a product of the 19th century.
Architectural historians call this the Gothic revival. And the Gothic really did stand for a kind of Victorian fantasy, a 19th century fantasy of medieval artisan craftsmanship, of a time of really taking care in making things by hand. And so we look at this and we just see an architectural style, but it's a style that's really associated with very specific values that the Victorians were trying to return to.
And in fact, Pugin, one of the 2 architects who worked on this building, published a book called Contrasts, which paired the modern and the medieval worlds. And the modern world did not come out well. It was a deeply moralizing book that looked at the way in which medieval society was full of moral virtue, but the modern society had squandered that. So, for example, there was one famous plate that showed the modern city where the skyline was dominated by factories and smokestacks versus the medieval city where the landscape was dominated by church steeples, that is, by a reverence for God, a kind of moral center.
comparison between a world guided by faith that he imagined was the medieval Gothic world and a world guided by hunger for money. And he's drawing very stark contrasts. But the Victorians love to do that. They love to compare the old medieval world of faith with the new modern quest for money and fortune.
And so it's important for us to understand a building like this within that Victorian context. Let's get back to the building itself. We see this magnificent exterior that just spans the edge of the River Thames. And we can see this reference back to the medieval style of the perpendicular Gothic. And in fact, it was very self-consciously based on the Chapel of Henry VII in this late Gothic style that we know as the perpendicular. That's just at the east end of Westminster Abbey, which is a building that is just behind this one. And here we can see these large windows, an emphasis on the rectilinear, on the vertical, on tracery and lacework.
We can see that each window has at its top tracery work that divides the glass up, almost like a filigree effect. The architect is really maximizing the window space. And this is a feature of the High Gothic.
Barry had traveled extensively and really loved the classical tradition, even though he's building here in this faux Gothic. But if you look closely, you can see Barry's interest in the classical. Look at the regularity of this facade. Look at the sense of rhythm and balance. And it's really only the exterior decorative forms that refer to the Gothic style, because the building as a whole is laid out with a kind of symmetry, regularity that is really at odds, even with the conception of the Gothic from the 18th and 19th centuries, where the idea of the picturesque, the idea of the organic, the idea of the asymmetrical was so important.
So we could say that this is, in some ways, a classical building with a Gothic skin on it.
Nevertheless, or perhaps because of this, the Houses of Parliament, it's just such an extraordinary example of the 19th century's concern for historical style.
And an interest in avoiding confronting the modern.
Okay, so let's go ahead and break that down. So what is it a revival of? Let me put my mic back in. There we go. So what is it a revival of? So it is a revival of classical architecture as well as what we call perpendicular Gothic. Now, we were really limited by how many Gothic churches we could see, and I really focused on looking at the Gothic in France because of time. But in England, there was a tradition of Gothic architecture as well, and it's often called perpendicular. So most Gothic churches in England didn't necessarily always reach towards the heavens. They had decorative elements that were thin and vertical that reached to the sky, like the towers that we've seen in Big Ben and the Central Tower, as well as the thin vertical elements. However, when you look at the entire structure itself, it has a very long sort of horizontal element to it. Notice how it's longer than it is vertical, right? So it's wider than it is vertical. And that's a component of the horizontal or the perpendicular style. But also, instead of allowing these vertical things to go up uninterrupted, you can also see that there are some horizontal elements across the windows, right? And it's not necessarily just the windows, but how they're broken up by these things that appear to look like railings, right? There's entablatures that go across. And so that is characteristic of that perpendicular style. Let's actually go back to this one. So in the video, they were mentioning how it feels very neoclassical as well. And so if you look at the Central Tower, that's the exact middle of the structure. And other than Big Ben and this tower here, the facade has two towers, right? Then two towers on the other side. And then there is a tower here and a tower here. And the Central Tower actually lines up perfectly with the middle. So you can see how there is an essence of symmetry with the overall structure. So besides being classical, it also has, besides being Gothic, it also has some classical tendencies as well. So modern characteristics, it has internal supports that they didn't mention in the video. So it has some metal internal supports. unlike just using pure masonry that they would have done or wood in the Gothic. It has a concrete platform at the base that goes into the earth. And then it also has that central ventilation tower as well as other ventilation. That would have been very modern for the day. So here are some of the other images that they've included. This is Westminster Hall. So this is a church structure that is incorporated into it. Some of this is actually original and it dates before the fire. It survived some of the original structure because this was a palace first. And so the palace would have had its own chapel. And so you can see it has wooden beams and supports, and it does have some Gothic characteristics to it where it points up with a pointed arch in the ceiling. And then we also have our central hall. There's some additional resources right here you can click on if you're interested. And then here we have just a close-up of the bare interior. You know, it would have had a little bit more decoration back in its day because this is a secular place now. Because this is a secular place now, probably some of that interior decoration has disappeared. So here we go to the central hall. So the central hall is located underneath this tower, right? It's in the very core. And so it was designed by Charles Barry. And this was a way of connecting the House of Parliament and the House of Lords. So that's very much like our Senate and House of Representatives, which are on either side of the hall. So there's hallways that lead to this, and then of course lead to that Westminster Hall, which is that church structure as well. So the function of this is it is a great place for members of both houses to meet with each other as well as their constituents. When we look at the interior decoration, notice how it has those intricate patterns of the floor. It has very much like the interior of a Gothic church. It's got sculptures. And so instead of these being religious images on the walls and on the sculptures, they're images of politicians. So just like we have images of politicians in the interior of our Capitol building, that's what's included here. You'll notice that the doorways have pointed arches, right? The windows have lancets. And so it really does look like a Gothic church interior. That leads us to just looking at a few more pieces. Here is the plan for our Capitol building and thinking about what it is a revival of. This kind of echoes back to our discussion of Thomas Jefferson and Monticello. So this is neoclassical revival. And the United States used a lot of neoclassical architecture to bring credibility to our new country. And so you can see the original design had a central dome. And so just like at the House of Parliaments, it was a in between, right? It was right in the middle to connect both the House and the smaller Senate buildings. And so this too is a great place to meet each other. Also has wonderful acoustics. So if you've never been in there, you should really see what that sounds like. If you stand on one side and go to the other side, you can hear the people clearly. So it actually is a bad place to make deals. But it was after the War of 1812. Actually, 1812 was White House, apologize. When it was actually finished, it went with a much more popular octagonal or pointed dome in the style of actually St. Paul's Church in London. And of course, St. Paul's Church in London is based on the Vatican. So it's instead of being based on maybe the Pantheon, right? That looks like a Pantheon dome. It actually looks more like St. Peter's. But you can see with this picture how it really is the center of Washington, D.C. You know, it's elevated just like a Roman temple, right? It has a temple front and so on. Even on the interior, the columns have some elements of Americanness to them. So the columns, instead of having acanthus leaves, which would be Greek, some of them have plants from the Americas. So this one has corn. Another neo-Gothic structure is Trinity Church. It's the oldest one, oldest revival church that's still in existence in New York City. And so a lot of famous weddings take place here. It has some of the oldest stained glass windows in the Americas. Going back to London, here's another example of revival. You might have heard of Crystal Palace. I know they have a soccer team. This is just basically like a suburb of London. And the name Crystal Palace today is known for a site in London, but it actually was a real building. So this was an exhibition hall where thousands upon thousands of people would go there every day, kind of like a World's Fair, to enjoy what the British colonies or the British Empire had to show for itself. So basically the people would go in there and would see the wares. They'd see people from all of the different colonies of the British Empire, the different parts of the Commonwealth, and they'd be able to see goods and peoples from these structures. So when you look at the structure itself, it's entirely made out of glass. I actually have an actual picture of it there, but it is actually a classical revival. It has rounded arches, right? And it has large interior spaces, just like Roman architecture. And Queen Victoria had this structure built right on top of some of her very favorite trees. So these are full-size trees that were not disturbed in the building of this. And so here you can see some of the exhibition halls, and there would have been things from Africa, from India, from different islands of the Pacific that were under British rule. And so Victorian England gobbled this up as this kind of exotic location to be seen, right? You dress up nice and walk around, and then you would also be able to see, what it looked like to be in other parts of the Commonwealth. This is a library in Paris. And so the exterior of it looks an awful lot like a Florentine palace or Italian palace with its rounded arches and kind of austere front. But the interior of it also has kind of Romanesque or rounded Roman characteristics of like a rounded arch. And instead of using stone, it uses the modern material of wrought iron. So this is things that you'd use for fencing. So it has kind of thin decorative elements to it, like the Gothic. And so this is like a building full of books, right? And knowledge. So it's kind of like very beautiful, decorative library. The last one we have is the Paris Opera Hall. It actually isn't used for opera anymore. It's actually used for the ballet. There's a newer opera hall in Paris. And so that's from an aerial view. But if we look at it from the front, you can see that it is a Baroque revival. So it just didn't, Baroque wasn't that long ago, but it was an extravagant style in the height of Louis XIV classicism. And it made sense that the opera, right, a very dramatic place to be, would be a great revival of the Baroque. And so the interior has this large staircase where it would be almost like you would be dressed up for the opera. And so you'd be able to almost like walk down it and people would be able to admire you. Large chandeliers, very dramatic revival sculpture, lots of ornate decorative details with all those chandeliers and so on. Okay, that is all we have for today.